38 years ago, I held him in my arms and promised my husband I would protect our son for the rest of my life. Today, that very same son looked at me with empty eyes and said, "Mom, pack your things. This house isn't yours anymore." No shouting, no argument. Just a flat tone, as if he were announcing something that didn't concern anyone at all. He stood in the middle of the living room, the very house my husband built with his own hands, and continued, each word slicing through the air like a knife. "Stephanie found you a temporary place near the nursing home. Clean, cheap, quiet. You'll get used to it." I stood there, hearing each word fall to the floor like pebbles dropping into my heart. Just minutes earlier, I had been making tea for the two of them. Now I was nothing more than an old object to be cleared away. I tried to speak, my voice trembling so much it startled even me. "You said, 'This house belongs to who?'" He didn't lift his head. His fingers flipped through a sheet of paper on the table, calm as a man signing a contract. "Mine. You signed it, remember? The day I told you it was for insurance paperwork. Didn't you read it?" I froze. I remembered that day. Stephanie had brought me tea, her voice gentle. "Just sign it, Mom. It's only a formality." And I believed her. I always believed my son, and the daughter-in-law I once treated like my own child. But that signature turned out to be my one-way ticket out of my own home. Ryan placed the house keys on the table. The metallic clink against the wood was dry and final. He went on, his tone light, almost casual. "In 2 days, the buyers will come to inspect the furniture. Please tidy things up for me, okay?" For me. Those 2 words stabbed straight into my chest. I looked around. Every corner, every object still carried traces of Charles, my late husband. The chair he used to drink tea in, the door he repainted after the storm, the pencil marks on the wall where we measured Ryan's height when he was 8. Everything was still there, except love. I whispered, not because I wanted an answer, but because the silence was killing me. "And your father's things?" Ryan shrugged. "I had them taken away. You shouldn't hold on to old stuff. Live light, Mom." Light. To him, throwing away 40 years of my life was just living light. Stephanie stood behind my son, smiling, polite enough not to be called cruel. I don't remember how I left the house. I only remember the sound of the door closing behind me, and the key turning once, briefly, but enough to tell me I was never coming back. That night, I rented a small roadside room. Tiny window, faded curtains, the sharp smell of bleach, like the scent of forgetting. I sat on the edge of the bed, still holding our old wedding photo. Me in a white dress, Charles smiling at me. He's gone now, and our son just told me, "Mom, pack your things and go." I laughed, a dry laugh like paper crumpling. There were no tears left to fall. That was the day I learned that sometimes the one who kills you doesn't need a knife. They just have to call you Mom in the voice of a stranger. That night, I sat in a cheap motel room, the yellow light casting uneven shadows across the stained wall. The air reeked of bleach, and the tile floor was icy cold. I sat on the edge of the bed, still holding the wedding photo with its frayed corners. Charles was smiling in the picture, his eyes as gentle as ever, while I looked like a stranger to myself. Outside, the wind slipped through the cracks of the window, sounding like a sigh. I still couldn't believe that just a few hours ago, my own son, the child I carried for 9 months, had told me I no longer had a home to return to. I tried to convince myself he must have been pressured by someone. Maybe Stephanie forced him. But the more I thought about it, the emptier I felt. No one could say words like that unless love had already disappeared. I opened my purse, searching to see what documents I still had left. Amid the receipts and notebooks, There was a folder Stephanie had handed me a few weeks earlier. Back then, she said it was just a temporary authorization for the insurance company to process things after Charles's passing. I had signed it without reading carefully. Now, under the dim light, my signature looked strange. The handwriting was mine, but the date had an added stroke, ink darker and heavier than the rest. I touched it, and a chill ran down my spine. Something was wrong. I turned to the last page. The heading didn't say anything about insurance. It read, "Full authorization for the management and transfer of fixed assets." My hand trembled as I held the paper. I didn't know much about law, but I knew this could take everything away from me. I folded the documents and sat still for hours. On my phone, a small news alert appeared. Ryan Moore's company faces bankruptcy risk. I opened it. The report said Ryan was seeking investors to save the company from massive debt. So that was it. It wasn't about caring for me. It was about the house. It was the only thing left he could sell. In his eyes, I wasn't his mother anymore, just a keeper of assets who refused to move. I laughed, a sound without tears, and inside me, something shifted, small but alive, like a flame flickering in the cold. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but I knew I needed answers. I remembered what Charles once told me. If anything ever happens to me, find Henry Clark. I trust him. I had forgotten those words until the night my own son threw me out. Tomorrow morning I would find Henry. No matter how painful the truth might be, I needed to know, because sometimes the scariest thing isn't losing everything. It's having it taken from you without ever knowing why. The next morning, I took the early bus to Henry Clark's office. I remembered he had been Charles's close friend, the one who handled all our family's property documents. On the way there, I sat quietly, watching the rows of houses fade in the bus window. The city looked the same, but I wasn't. I was no longer the woman protected by her husband and respected by her son. I was just an old woman betrayed by her own blood. Henry's office was on the third floor of a red brick building. When I stepped inside, the air smelled faintly of old wood and ink, the scent of truths buried deep within paperwork. The young secretary asked for my name, then went inside. Moments later, Henry appeared. He looked older than I remembered, but his eyes were still kind and clear. When he saw me, he froze for a second. "Evelyn, my goodness, I thought you were abroad." I frowned. "Who told you that?" He lowered his voice. "Ryan, he said you were away on an extended trip and asked me to help him finalize Charles's estate on your behalf." I felt the blood drain from my face. "And you believed him?" Henry sighed and gestured for me to sit. "I did, because he's your son. But now I see that might have been a mistake." He opened a drawer and took out a sealed envelope. "Charles asked me to keep the original will. I think it's time you saw it." My hands trembled as I unfolded the papers. Charles had left the entire house and 75% of all assets to me. Ryan was to receive the remainder only if he treated me with respect and filial devotion. I looked up, my voice breaking. He told me I had nothing, that I was just living there out of pity. He even showed me a notarized deed proving the house was in his name. Henry frowned, pulling a magnifying glass closer. "I know this notary office. This seal's a fake. The ink doesn't match. Evelyn, this is a serious act of fraud. Someone used an old signature of yours, probably from that authorization form, and attached it to a forged property transfer." My chest tightened. "Can it be undone?" "Yes," he said firmly. "I'll contact the police and request a temporary freeze on all related assets. Are you ready for that?" I nodded. "Do it, Henry. I've stayed silent long enough." He looked at me for a moment, then smiled faintly. Charles once told me you had a soft heart, but not a foolish one. He believed that if anyone ever betrayed you, you'd find a way to stand again. I held the real will in my hands, a thin piece of paper that suddenly felt as heavy as a lifetime. When I stepped out of the building, the morning wind blew hard, tousling my hair. But inside, something was beginning to steady. Like an old tree after a storm, its roots still deep in the earth. I knew the storm was only beginning, but this time I wouldn't just survive. I would reclaim everything, not for the money, but for the trust they had broken. That afternoon, light rain fell outside. I sat in my small rented room, a cup of cold tea on the table, watching raindrops slide down the window pane. Henry had just called with news. The bank confirmed the transfer documents are fake. They've temporarily frozen all accounts under Ryan Moore's name for investigation. The police have been notified. I only said one sentence. "Thank you, Henry." No shaking, no tears, just a strange, steady calm. The kind of stillness that comes only after you've lost everything, or when you've decided you won't lose anymore. About an hour later, my phone vibrated. Ryan's name flashed on the screen. I stared at it for a long time. The name of my own son. Yet now it felt like an old wound reopening. I answered. On the other end, his voice was filled with panic and anger. "Mom, what did you do? The bank said my accounts are frozen. My company's being investigated. What did you tell them?" I stayed silent for a few seconds. Outside, the rain had grown heavier, drumming against the old tin roof. Then I spoke, my tone slow and even. "I didn't say anything, I just gave them what you should have given them, the real will your father left behind." There was a pause. I could almost picture his face, draining of color. "What? You found the will?" "Yes. Your father left everything to me. Only a small portion to you, under one condition, one you broke from the very beginning." Ryan's voice faltered. "Mom, that's not true. I was trying to save the company. Stephanie said if you signed a few papers, I could get a short-term loan. You know I never meant to hurt you." I let out a faint laugh, one that even I barely recognized as my own. "You didn't mean to hurt me? Then what do you call forging my signature? Throwing away your father's things? Kicking me out of the house he built?" His tone hardened, mixed with guilt and fear. "Mom, you don't understand. I owe too much. If I didn't do this, the company would collapse. I did what I had to do." I replied coldly. "Owing money doesn't mean you're allowed to owe your integrity. And as for me, Ryan, I've paid every debt a mother can pay." I heard him breathing heavily, then silence. Finally, he asked softly, "What are you going to do?" My voice was calm, steady, like reading a verdict. "I'm not doing anything. The law will take care of the rest. As for me, I'm going home." On the line, I heard him jump up, something crashing to the floor. "Mom, no, you don't understand what this means. If you do this, I'll lose everything." I looked out the window, where the rain hit the glass in dull, rhythmic taps. "No, Ryan, you lost everything long ago, the day you chose money over your mother." I hung up. Outside, the rain kept falling, but something inside me was dissolving. Not sadness, but the fog that had blinded me for 40 years. I sat quietly, listening to the steady beat of my own heart. Henry called again soon after. "Evelyn, the police will be involved soon. Are you all right?" "I'm fine," I said. "For the first time in years, I'm doing what's right." He paused, his voice softening. "Charles would be proud of you." I didn't answer. I just looked out the window as the last weak rays of daylight filtered through the rain and touched my hands. I closed my fingers slowly and whispered to myself, "I once raised him with love. Now I'll teach him with truth. I set the phone down on the table, letting the silence spread. Maybe tomorrow everything would unravel. Maybe I'd have to face another storm. But at least this time I wasn't afraid. Because now, the one who was afraid wasn't me. The next morning, I went to the police station to give my statement. Everything happened faster than I expected. They asked, I answered, calmly, clearly, as if I had been preparing for this day all my life. When I stepped out of the interrogation room, Henry was waiting in the hallway, holding a cup of coffee. He said quietly, "Good, Evelyn, everything's being handled. Now you should go back and see the house." I nodded. I needed to look at that place one last time. Not out of regret, but to face the pain head on. That afternoon, Henry and I drove to the old house. The home I had been thrown out of was now sealed for investigation. When the car stopped, I looked through the familiar window. The curtains were new, the walls a different color, but the shape of the house remained the same. It was still the place Charles had built, brick by brick, stair by stair, with his own hands. The wooden gate creaked softly as Henry opened it. I stepped into the yard, and the scent of damp wood and old soil rushed over me like a wave. The rose bushes by the porch were gone, replaced by expensive ornamental plants. I bent down and picked up a shard of broken pottery, perhaps from the flower pot I once planted for Charles. The fragment was small, but still had bits of dry earth clinging to it. I brushed my finger across the soil and whispered, "At least this part hasn't been sold yet." Henry stood beside me in silence. "They were planning a full renovation," he said. "There's even a design proposal filed, but everything's on hold now." I nodded, my eyes fixed on the house. "Good, because when they painted over these walls, they forgot. Some wounds can't be covered." I stepped inside. The living room was quiet, sunlight glinting faintly through the glass panels. Everything had been rearranged, new furniture, old photos gone, Stephanie's perfume lingering faintly in the air. Yet amid all of it, I could still see Charles sitting in his old chair, reading the paper, the sunlight spilling across his shoulder. In my mind, I heard his voice. "Evelyn, a house is just walls and a roof. You are its soul." I walked slowly toward the wall where Charles once marked Ryan's height. Someone had painted over it, but the faint pencil lines still showed through. I ran my fingers over them, the surface rough and uneven. The smooth white paint could not erase what was beneath, memory and betrayal. Henry placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. "Evelyn, are you all right?" I smiled faintly. "I am. Some things you need to see with your own eyes to understand just how deep the betrayal runs." We stood there for a few minutes, listening to the wind whistling through the doorframe. Then I said, "Henry, I want to keep this house, but I won't live in it the way I used to. I want to turn it into a place where trust can never be bought again." He nodded. "I understand. I'll help you set up a foundation and make everything official once the case is over." As we left, I turned back for one last look. The house was no longer a home. It was evidence, a lesson, and a warning. I felt light, not because I'd reclaimed property, but because I'd reclaimed myself. That night, back in my room, I checked my phone. There was a message from Ryan's number. "Mom, I'm sorry. Please stop. I'm scared. I'll lose everything." I stared at the words, reading them over and over. Then I deleted the message without replying. Because sometimes forgiving too soon is its own kind of sin. I turned off the light and sat in the dark. Outside, it had started to rain again. But this time, I didn't feel cold. I knew the rain wouldn't wash everything away, but it would help me stand up clean. 2 days later, the police launched a formal investigation. I didn't need Henry to tell me. The whole city knew. That morning, while sitting in a small cafe near City Hall, I saw Ryan's face flash across the news. Reporters crowded around him, cameras firing nonstop. His face was pale, hollow, his suit wrinkled. Beside him, Stephanie tried to hide behind her handbag. The headline scrolled slowly across the screen. CFO Ryan Moore under investigation for asset fraud and falsification of inheritance documents. I watched it all, feeling neither satisfaction nor sadness, just a hollow stillness. I had thought that when justice finally came, I would feel vindicated, but no. A mother never wins when her child falls. I only felt tired to the bone. That afternoon, Henry called. "Evelyn, they want you present for the confrontation. Are you ready?" I paused for a moment, then replied, "I've been ready since the day he threw me out of my house." The interrogation room was stark white, its gray walls reflecting the cold fluorescent lights. Ryan sat at the far end of the table, head bowed, hands clasped together, trembling slightly. Gone was the confident face of a successful executive. What sat before me was a 38-year-old man, my son, facing both his mother and the law. The investigator opened the file, his voice firm and dry. "Mr. Moore, we have evidence that you used your mother's old authorization papers, forged her signature, and falsified notarization to transfer ownership of her property. Do you admit to this?" Ryan lowered his head, his voice weak. I didn't mean to. I just followed my wife's advice. I thought it was temporary." I looked at him, the boy who had once been so pure, now a stranger. My voice was calm, deliberate. "No one can make you do something you don't already allow, Ryan. If you truly believed you were doing the right thing, you wouldn't be hiding." He lifted his head, eyes red and wet. "Mom, I just wanted to save the company. I didn't want to lose everything. I thought if I succeeded, you'd be proud of me." I met his gaze. "Proud? No, Ryan, I don't need a son who succeeds by stepping on others. I'd rather see you lose everything and still keep your dignity than be rich and have none." He said nothing, then began to cry. Not loudly, but in small, trembling gasps, like a child swallowing his sobs. I stayed still. I didn't reach out to hold him, didn't say another word. Sometimes the only way for someone to grow up is to let them feel the pain themselves. The session ended after 15 minutes. When they led Ryan out, he stopped at the door and turned to look at me. His eyes were full of remorse, wet, empty, broken. I spoke softly, just loud enough for him to hear. "Trust Ryan. Once it's broken, you can patch it up, but it will never be clear again." He lowered his head and walked away. The door closed, and with the sound of the lock clicking into place, I knew a part of my old life had closed with it. That evening, I didn't go home. I walked through the park across from City Hall. The rain had just stopped. The leaves were still wet, the ground glistening with puddles. Children were playing tag, their laughter ringing through the damp air, so pure it hurt to hear. I thought of Ryan, the little boy who used to run around the yard, tugging at my skirt, laughing as I pretended to be angry. I had raised him with every ounce of love I had, and that love he had learned to use until he thought I would stay weak forever. I sat on a park bench watching the sunset fade behind the buildings. The light turned the city into a dull bronze, the color of things that once shone bright but have slowly aged. And in that fading glow, I understood something. True victory doesn't come when someone else pays the price. It comes when you can face the truth without hate. I stood up and walked slowly along the wet cobblestone path. The streetlights flickered on, casting soft gold over my shadow, stretching long behind me. For the first time in months, I felt truly free. Not because I had reclaimed the house, but because I had reclaimed myself. No one could ever throw me out of my own life again. A week after the confrontation, the house was officially returned to me. Henry handed me the keys and said, "All the temporary procedures are done. The case still needs to go to trial, but the victory is almost certain to be yours." I nodded, thanked him, and watched as he left. Then I stood alone in the familiar kitchen, listening to the wind brushing through the window frame. The house was so quiet I could hear the ticking of the clock, each sound like the breath of someone long gone. I began to tidy up, not to erase Ryan's presence, but to rediscover the traces of Charles, the man I had lived beside for 40 years, yet perhaps never truly understood. I opened his old filing cabinet in the study. The documents were neatly stacked, organized to perfection, the kind of order that hurt to look at. Charles had always been that way, meticulous, reserved, saying little. I had always thought he had nothing to hide. Until I found a thick envelope tucked inside a leather notebook. On the cover, written in his familiar slanted handwriting, were the words, "If you're reading this, it means I'm gone." I sat down and opened it. Inside were old papers and a letter. His handwriting was still the same, strong, steady, yet somehow tender. I read slowly, each word sinking deep into me. "Evelyn, if you're reading this, I'm no longer there with you. I'm not writing to apologize, but to explain. For years, my company was involved in investments that weren't clean. I thought I could fix it, but the deeper I went, the harder it became to escape. When I finally realized the truth, I cooperated with the government as a witness. The money in my accounts isn't all tainted, but it isn't all clean either. I tried to keep you and Ryan safe from it all, but I know. Once I'm gone, someone will try to take what's left. Maybe a business partner, maybe even our own son. I'm not telling you this to scare you, but to remind you, if one day someone betrays you, don't see it as an ending. See it as proof that you are stronger than you think. I love you. I just wasn't good at saying it while I was alive." I set the letter down, my heart sinking. So Charles had known. He knew everything I had never dared to imagine. I felt a lump rise in my throat, not from anger, but from something softer. He had lived his life fearing the loss of honor, while I had lived mine fearing the loss of him and of our son. We had loved each other, but never truly shared ourselves. I went through the remaining documents. There were government cooperation contracts, stamped and signed by investigators from years ago. Charles hadn't been guilty. He had helped expose a money laundering ring. At the end of the file, I found a smaller note, just a name, Agent M. Parker, with Charles's handwriting beneath. "If things ever go bad, he'll know how to help Evelyn." I laughed softly, a sad, tender laugh. Charles, the quiet man who rarely showed affection, had still found a way to protect me even after death. And I, for years, had resented him for being distant, but he had loved me in his own way, silent, steady, enduring. That evening, I brewed a cup of tea and sat on the porch. The air was cool. A fine drizzle brushed against the light from the living room, casting a warm glow across the tiled floor. I looked at our old wedding photo resting on the table. Wooden frame, glass slightly fogged. I spoke softly, as if Charles were sitting beside me. "You were a clever man, Charles, so clever that it made me both angry and proud. But you were right. I'm stronger than I thought. And I'll live the rest of my life for both of us." I took a sip of tea. The soft bitterness spread across my tongue. Somewhere in the wind, I could almost hear Charles's calm, steady voice. "I know, Evelyn. You've always been the strongest one in this house." I looked up at the sky, a thin but genuine smile forming. In that moment, I no longer felt like a woman betrayed. I was simply someone learning to forgive my son, my husband, and myself. 3 days later, Henry sent me a short message. "I've contacted a man named Parker. He wants to meet you. Former FBI office, Midtown, 10 a.m. I stared at the message for a long time. The name Parker, the one in Charles's note, had echoed in my mind for nights. I didn't know who he was, but it felt as if I were about to meet a missing piece of Charles. A part of him I had never truly understood. That morning I chose to wear the old gray coat Charles once said looked better on me than anything expensive. When I looked in the mirror, I saw a 69-year-old woman, silver hair, dark circles under her eyes, but still standing tall. No longer the woman who had been thrown out of her own home, but someone walking into the room of her past for the last time, with eyes wide open. The old FBI building stood at the end of a quiet street. When I walked in, a man in his early 60s, tall, lean, in a light blue vest over a white shirt, was waiting. His eyes were deep, his voice rough but warm. "Mrs. Moore?" I nodded. He extended his hand. "Michael Parker, I worked with Charles." We sat down in a small office with a window overlooking a park. The midday light filtered through a thin white curtain, bathing the room in a soft golden hue. Parker poured me a glass of water and began to speak, his voice measured and sincere. Charles was a remarkable man. He wasn't just a witness. He volunteered to cooperate, risking his own reputation to help us dismantle a major money laundering network. I owe him a lot. Without Charles, many innocent people would have lost everything. I sat quietly, listening. Parker's gaze drifted as if seeing something distant. But he was also a lonely man. I remember once, he told me, "I have a strong wife, and I'm afraid that if I tell her the truth, she'll never look at me the same way again." I exhaled slowly, my heart tightening. "He was wrong," I said softly. "I never needed a perfect husband. I just needed an honest one. But maybe he didn't know. When women love, they forgive more easily than men think." Parker nodded gently. "I believe that, and I think he knew it too. He just ran out of time to say so." He reached into his briefcase and placed a small USB drive on the table. "This contains copies of Charles's cooperation files. There's nothing classified left, and by law they belong to you. But there's one more thing." I looked up. Charles once spoke to us about creating a fund to use the compensation he earned to help elderly people who were victims of financial scams. He never got the chance to do it. Maybe you could finish what he started? I sat in silence for a long while. The midday light shimmered across the table, refracting through the glass of water, scattering into tiny moving fragments. I thought of everything, the house, the forged papers, Ryan's eyes, Charles's letter. Everything seemed to connect, forming a single, unbroken line that had led me to this moment. "If that's what Charles wanted," I said quietly, almost a whisper, "then I'll do it." Parker nodded. "I knew you would." When I stepped out of the building, I paused on the front steps and looked up at the sky. Thin clouds drifted lazily, and the blue stretched endlessly toward the horizon. I felt as though Charles was up there somewhere, watching me through the light. That night, I wrote the first line of a new plan, the Charles Moore Foundation, helping elderly victims of financial fraud reclaim their dignity. And beneath the title, I added a smaller line just for myself. Founded by a woman who lost everything and learned to rise from where she fell. I stared at the words for a long time. In the quiet, I felt something inside me finally ease. Not because I had forgiven everyone, but because at last I had forgiven myself. A month after my meeting with Mr. Parker, the Charles Moore Foundation was officially established. The small office was on the second floor of an old building in a quiet neighborhood. The sign outside was simple, white wood with hand-carved letters. For those who have lost and wish to find themselves again. On the opening day, Henry brought a bouquet of pale roses arranged in an old glass vase. He placed it on the desk and smiled softly. "Charles would be proud of you," I replied. "I don't know where he is now, but I believe he's smiling." We didn't hold a grand ceremony. There were only a few old friends, 2 elderly neighbors, and a small group of people who had once been victims of financial fraud, sharing their stories. An old man named Raymond held my hand, his eyes misty. "You know," he said, "when I lost everything, I thought I didn't deserve to live. But hearing your story today, maybe God decided to give me another chance." I squeezed his hand gently and whispered, "I once thought the same, but sometimes losing everything is how we learn to stand again, without holding on to anyone else." That afternoon, after everyone had left, I stayed alone in the office. The late sunlight filtered through the curtains, spreading gold across the desk. On the wall, I hung a black and white photograph of Charles, smiling, a hammer in his hand, his eyes still as bright as they once were. Beneath it, a small wooden plaque bore the words I had written by hand. "Strength is not measured by age, but by the courage to begin again." Henry appeared at the doorway. "Evelyn, are you tired? You've been talking all day." I shook my head. "No, I feel younger than I did 10 years ago." He chuckled. "Maybe because you're finally living." I smiled. "Not just living, Henry. For the first time in a long while, I'm living for myself." That evening I went home. The house had been repainted, simple, bright, with no trace of the chaos that once filled it. On the table lay a letter from Ryan, the first since the day of our confrontation. "Mom, I've received my sentence, 3 years probation and financial restitution. I don't blame you, I know you did what was right. Stephanie's gone. Maybe that's the price I have to pay. I just hope that when I'm free, I can see you. Not to ask for forgiveness, only to tell you that I finally understand." I folded the letter carefully and placed it in the drawer. No tears, no smile, just a quiet sense of peace. Maybe every wound, once deep enough, eventually turns into calm acceptance. I brewed a cup of tea and stepped out onto the porch. The night sky was still, the air filled with the soft scent of jasmine carried by the breeze. I looked out at the garden, at the new rosebuds sprouting from the very bushes Charles once planted, tender green and proud. I whispered as if to the wind, "Thank you for every loss," because without them I'd never have known how deeply I could still love life. In the distance, the church bells rang. Another day ended, quietly and gently. I took a deep breath, closed my eyes, and smiled. The flame that had gone out the day Ryan threw me out of my home was burning again. Not the flame of anger, nor of resentment, but a small, steady, warm flame of a woman who finally understood this truth. No loss is ever meaningless if you know how to use it to light the way for someone else. I tell this story not to seek pity, nor to condemn a son who went astray. I tell it because I know there are many like me, people who have been betrayed by those they loved most, who have lost everything and thought their life was over. But it isn't. Life never ends at a closed door. It simply begins again somewhere we've never dared to go. The day Ryan threw me out of my house, I thought I had lost everything. Now I understand. It was the day life gave me the chance to find myself again. I no longer have the perfect home or a complete family, but I have something I never truly had before: freedom of the soul. I've learned that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. Forgiveness means being strong enough to look directly at your wound, touch it, and say, "You hurt me once, but you no longer have power over me." I've also learned that kindness without awareness becomes a trap of its own. I once believed a mother's love should be unconditional. Now I know true love isn't about giving endlessly. It's about knowing when to stop, when sacrifice turns into self-destruction. If you're listening to this story and there's a pain in your heart that hasn't healed, remember this. We cannot choose how others treat us, but we can choose how we rise after we've been hurt. You may have lost something, a person, a place, a belief, but don't ever lose your self-respect. I was once a mother thrown out of her own home. Now I am a woman standing in that same house, looking up at her husband's photograph, saying, "My dear Charles, I'm still here, and I'm still standing strong." I believe everyone will have a day like that. The day you rise from the very place where you once fell, and realize that the most precious thing you own isn't wealth, but the strength to begin again. If this story makes you think of someone who once hurt you, don't rush to hate them. Thank them in their own way. They helped you discover how strong you truly are. Thank you for listening. And if today you find yourself in the middle of a storm, trust me, every storm eventually fades. And when the sun rises, you'll understand. No loss is ever meaningless if you know how to use it to light the way for someone else. If you're hearing these words, maybe you too have gone through a pain like mine, hurt by someone you love, or losing something you once thought you couldn't live without. I just want you to know this: no one stays weak forever. Sometimes all it takes is a single crack for the light to find its way in. If my story reminds you of your own, leave a comment below. Tell me how you found your way through your storm. Because who knows, your story might become the light that guides someone else out of their darkness. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss the next journeys, stories of love, forgiveness, and new beginnings at any age. Thank you for listening. I'll see you in the next story, where we'll keep believing that every loss has its purpose and every wound can become strength.